Good afternoon, everybody. Hello again. I'm going to talk about larch this time only, not any other species. And this is mostly a slideshow. I'm telling now the story of larch breeding in Iceland, how it started and and what its status is today. Icelandic larch breeding started in Maine, at the University of Maine in the United States, where I became intimately familiar with the sex lives of conifers, and especially larch. And these are some of the larch that I produced there. And one of the things that I learned there was that larch, unlike most tree species, but larch can sometimes show hybrid vigor, what is called hybrid vigor, which is that hybrids grow better than either of the parents. When I came back to Iceland in 1992 from my studies, Jón Loftsson, the director of the Forest Service, and Árni Bragason, who was then director at the Forest Research Station at Mógilsá, saw some merit in what I had learned and what I said I could do, so they put me to work selecting plus trees in Icelandic forest, and that was a lot of fun. I found out that there are almost no straight larch trees in Iceland, and when you find one, it is very easily recognizable. And I found about 45 of them. The next step was to take cuttings from them and graft them, which we did in the years 93 to 94, and we did this in a greenhouse in northern Iceland, in Vaglaskóg. And that's what it looked like 2 years later. Grafted larch growing in pots in a greenhouse. The first flowering came in 1995, and I did controlled crosses between 1995 and 99 on the flowering that was taking place in the greenhouse. And I made several controlled crosses. Mostly, though, I made open pollinated crosses. In other words, I made a pollen mix and crossed onto females to make half-sib families. And these half-sib families were then supposed to go out into progeny trials. This is traditional breeding, except it is accelerated by doing it in the greenhouse and by doing things to the larch to get it to flower. I was able to get flowering early. This is not like so this is called accelerated breeding, and you can see that within the first decade, I had material to put out progeny trials. Within 8 years, I had material to put out progeny trials. And at the same time, we lobbied for better conditions to use, and we got funding to build a breeding and seed production greenhouse in Vaglaskóg in North Iceland, and that's it. Then, starting in 2000, in the year 2000, and then again in 2003, I put out 4 progeny trials in 4 places in Iceland, covering all of the families that I had then, but not families from all of the originally selected trees. Some of them were recalcitrant, what's called recalcitrant. They did not flower no matter what I did, and they were then thrown out of the breeding program. Because you can't run a breeding program with trees that don't flower. And this is what one of the places looked like 2 years, after 2 years. And then something interesting happened. This is the same place 2 years later than that. And some of the trees started growing much better than some of the other ones. you can see here that these are all 4 years old, and to see a 4-year-old tree in Iceland that looks like this was something that nobody had seen before. We expected this, or perhaps that as something good. But then we all of a sudden got this. And what that was, and then in South Iceland, that was the place in East Iceland, and then a year later in South Iceland, where we have been trying to grow larch for many years, but in Mosfell, but it doesn't grow well there. These families all of a sudden grew extremely well there and reached almost the height of a person in 5 years. And what it turned out to be was that these families that grew so well were all progeny of clone number 8. Either crossed as a female parent with a variety of other clones here, or used as a male parent with a variety of other clones, or used as a female parent crossed with a mix, a pollen mix from other clones. And these families all were much better already at age 5 than all the rest. You can see some of the parents. These are, for instance, 12 is from Hausjärvi in Finland, and 18 is from Örnsköldsvik. These were selected trees in Iceland of these provenances. 28 and 29 are Arkangelsk. Number 4 is from Mustila, and so on. But you can see that here's number 18. Here's number 18, for instance, crossed with a pollen mix, and here is number 18 crossed with number 8. So these are half sibs, actually, half sibling families. But this cross of tree number 8 was special. And here's tree number 8. The provenance, it's growing in Hallormsstaðir forest in East Iceland. The provenance is called Blairwood, which is in Scotland. And I asked the people at Blair Athol what place there was called Blairwood, and they didn't know of one, but this must be the Blair Athol estate in central Scotland, where they put out some of the first hybrid larch, in other words, European-Japanese hybrid larch in Scotland, along with a lot of European larch, a lot of Japanese larch that grows there. And this seed came from there. And in this stand where it grows, there are a lot of crooked trees. This was said to be hybrid larch, in other words, said to be European-Japanese hybrid larch. But I think that the crooked trees and the trees that died are actually that hybrid. The ones that survived are probably pure European larch, because in attempts to make the European-Japanese larch hybrid, they often fail because there is a difference in flowering time between the two species, and what you end up with is either pure European larch or pure Japanese larch. This clone number 8 had nothing to indicate that it had any Japanese larch genes. The cones looked purely European larch, the flowers looked like European larch flowers, both in color and in shape, and so I think this is purely European larch, possibly originally from Tyrol or somewhere in the Alps, with one generation in Scotland and then came to Iceland. So, these families that did so well were hybrids. They were hybrids between this European larch parent and a variety of Russian, Siberian larch parents. So they were European-Siberian hybrids. So, when we had these results, we changed course. The idea was originally to improve Siberian larch for Icelandic conditions, to make it a little bit better adapted, to improve its straightness and hopefully its growth rate as well. Then when we had this hybrid, we saw, okay, why even work with Siberian larch anymore? Also, what had happened in the meantime between 1992, when it was cold, and 2005, when it had warmed up quite a bit, was that Siberian larch was looking less and less like a future species for Iceland. Even if we were able to improve it, it was still not well enough adapted to our conditions. But these families obviously were the ones that were crossed with clone number 8. So when we regrafted, because indoor orchards don't last forever, they don't live forever, the trees need to be renewed every once in a while, and when we regrafted, half of the grafts were of this clone number 8 and half were of the 20 best Siberian larch clones from the orchard, from the progeny trials. So we have an orchard that produces hybrids. We selected a name for this hybrid. Everything has to have a name, you know. And we selected the name Hrymur. Hrymur is a giant. It's found in Völuspá. He comes out of the east. Putin, yeah. And he is one of the giants that does battle with the Æsir at Ragnarök. But this European Russian larch hybrid that we produce in North Iceland is called Hrymur, and as it turns out, the cross works equally well both ways. We can use a pollen mix from the Siberian larches to pollinate the cones on clone number 8, the European larch, and we use pollen from clone number 8 to pollinate the Siberian larch trees. That means that we are creating half-sib families. We are creating a half-sib family with the European larch as the mother, and we are creating about 20 full-sib families with the Siberian larch as the mother. And this is called Hrymur. And this is how we create these families. I gather together all the people in Vallaskógur and Akureyri that want to come, and we spend 2 or 3 days doing this. It's often very quiet, very still in the greenhouse. Sometimes there's some talking, but mostly we're just concentrating on trying to put the pollen onto the female cones. We collect the pollen by hand, and we put it onto the female cones using brushes. This is controlled pollination. We have all the European larches on one side of the greenhouse and all the Siberian larches on the other side of the greenhouse, and then we just move the pollen over. There is some pollen contamination, but in my studies at the University of Maine, I looked at pollination without pollination bags in a greenhouse environment, and with larch, which has pollen that is perfectly spherical, it has no wings. Of course, pollen doesn't flap its wings, but it doesn't blow very well. So when you dab some pollen on the female cone, the rest of it just drops straight down. It doesn't go very far, and so there's very little contamination. So the hybrid that we make is probably between 90 and 95% hybrid individuals. The first good seed harvest was in 2013, and we got enough seed then to grow about 400,000 seedlings. 400,000 seedlings is roughly half of our annual larch planting. But we divided this between 2 years, so it was sown mostly in 2014, and most of the rest of it will be sown this spring, so we'll get about 150,000 seedlings this spring and another 150,000 next spring to be planted along with other larch in Icelandic forestry. And there will be a little bit left for sowing in 2016, but by then we hope to have a new seed lot. With such fairly heavy flowering that we got 2013, we didn't get any flowering last year. So we can't expect seed production every year. Every 2 or 3 years, though. And Hrymur this year will be about 20% of larch that is planted in Iceland. And we've been talking to forest farmers about it, and they're excited about it, and some of them even mark their little plots where they got a few plants a few years ago with a name. And the result of the progeny trials is that we don't need to select any specific site types for this larch. It grows much better than other larch on relatively poor land, like we select for larch in general. And Hrymur continues to impress. These are some of the first ones, the first seedlings from the greenhouse orchard. This was taken last year at Mógilsá, and of some of the first seedlings that were produced. And these trees are about 9 meters tall. Here's our 2 pictures taken at the same place with 11 years apart. You can see because of the cliff that the arrow is pointing to. It even grows well in southwest Iceland. This picture is taken at Litlafellsöxl, which you passed on the way here. You may not have seen it because of the snowstorm, but you can actually, if you know where to look, you can actually see this from the road. And the youngest, but by far the biggest trees in this picture are Hrymur. He planted them way too densely. But this is here in maritime southwest Iceland. And this is what the greenhouse orchard looked like last fall. The Siberian larch changes colors earlier than the European larch. And these are grafts, so they show some plagiotropic growth. I don't know how many of you know what plagiotropic growth is, but that doesn't matter. So, with this final picture of Hrymur growing at Múlakot, thank you. Björgvin, myndirnar koma ekki hérna.
Takk fyrir þetta, Þröstur. Við erum ennþá með svolítið tíma ef einhverjir hafa spurningar fyrir Þröst. If you have any questions for Þröstur, we still have time. Aðalsteinn.
I don't actually have any questions for Þröstur because I know everything he knows now. No, I'm interested. It's an interesting story because the European larch you're using is from Dunkeld,
thereabouts,
Lair Woods, or whatever you want to call it. So that has a very interesting story behind it because in the 18th century, the Duke of Atholl had some seedlings of European larch in his hothouse, his greenhouse, and he thought this was some kind of vegetation that needed to stay in the greenhouse all year long because it came from south, to Italian Tyrol. And then he received the visit from the ambassador to the Sardinian state, who pointed out to him that he should actually plant these trees outdoors. And he did that the following spring. And these were 5 trees, and they soon started to flourish, and they started to bear cones and seed, and they were seeded. And it's probably estimated that most of Scottish European larch is from these 5 trees because they were planted and seeded all over. They were even direct seeded by cannons in the mountains around. And this kind of this leads to another question about the genetic homogeneity of this European larch in Scotland on the one hand, and then perhaps the genetic homogeneity of this Hrymur if it's really a open pollinated single cross. You mentioned just towards the end of your talk that you were testing other promising European large clones. Is this the plan to really broaden the genetic base for this breeding population?
Yes, we have the Sardinian ambassadors to Scotland much to thank for this. Yes, I'm a little bit worried about the narrow genetic base of Hrymur. So we have already 3 other European large clones in the population, and we're going to start grafting some more this spring and fill the greenhouse. Only half the greenhouse has been filled with larch to now. We will fill the rest of it with larch in the next 2 or 3 years, and we will add some more European larch parents to test as well.
Ætlum við láta þetta ekki duga. Takk fyrir, Þröstur.